it's a great honor and pleasure to have Johannes Niederhauser with us today, who completed a doctorate on Martin Heidegger on the theme of being and death.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
At the University of Warwick, under the supervision of Stephen Holgate. Okay. And today you're going to be instructing us about Plato.
Yes.
So we're looking forward to it very much indeed, Johannes. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for the invitation, Douglas. It allowed me to write up my thoughts on Plato on myth. It gave me a deadline. I apologize for my pronunciation of the English, but thankfully, as you all know, the Greek will be perfect because the Greeks, of course, have a German accent. It's an old parallel that we have. Anyways, here's a quote from Pierre Hadot, perhaps to get us in the mood. The philosophy treatise, Hadot writes, whether written in prose or in verse, then appears as a kind of microcosm whose genesis and structure reproduce those of the universe. All right, so despite his apparent banishment of the poets, so they remove us by 2 levels from reality, Plato describes the endeavor of the politeia as akin to writing a myth. In Book 2, in context of the musical education of the guardians, and also the question which poetry to allow and which to ban, Plato refers to the topic of the dialogue as akin to a myth, hosper en mythologuntes, he says. In the same book, Plato writes, to logo exarches poiomen polin, in logos, in thought and in speech, let us make up the polis poetically from the ground up. Or would anyone wish to suggest that Plato here merely notes down mimetically a historical dialogue that the historical Socrates had in exactly this fashion in a factual, beautiful city where philosophers happened to rule? That this does not preclude the possibility of the Callipolis might give us a first hint at the relationship between philosophical logos, mythos, and being and becoming. Rather than falling for the schematic reflex that logos replaces mythos, perhaps we should ask why Plato continuously employs myths in his dialogues, why sometimes gods are prayed to and called upon in order to guide the dialogue. For example, Mnemosyne at the beginning of the Critias or Eros in the Phaedrus. Why the Socrates of the Apologia takes seriously an oracle from the Delphic Python Apollon, and that he, quote, at the god's behest, I give aid to the god, as he says, that is to say, he's called upon by God and serving God, in this case Apollo, that he searches for those who are as wise as him, knowing, however, that they are not wise and that he himself is not wise. This prompts the question about the relationship between philosophy and myth at the beginning of philosophy proper, or philosophia, with Plato. As you know, Plato also changes the meaning of the word philosophia. Is the simple progressive story that logos replaces mythos true? Or is this schematic view rather itself a contemporary myth which heralds the triumph of sober rationality over hubristic and unruly imagination? But why at all should mythos and logos, if we want to use these 2 terms, or if we want to use maybe more contemporary terms, imagination and rationality, be diametrically opposed poles, as Wilhelm Nestle suggested? Nestle's sharp distinction between the poles of Vorstellung and Vernunft, we could also perhaps say myth and logos, follows Hegelian terminology, but does not rise to the level of integration and sublation that Hegel's philosophy of the spirit in the Encyclopedia achieves. Hegel determines Vorstellung as remembered intuition, and as such as the middle between the immediate finding in self-determined of intelligence and between the lesser in its freedom thinking. Hegel thus allows for a concrete, ground together unity of all moments in which spirit moves: feeling, intuition, imagination, representation, intelligence, reason, memory. Each of these moments requires the other moment to arrive at the, quote, concrete immanence of the concept. Even though Plato criticizes the anthropomorphic myths of Hesiod and Homer, he still, however, maintains myth in a similar vein as Hegel allows for the imagination as a moment necessary for insight. Different from Hegel, Plato often returns to mythic tales rather than to pure logic to let the forms appear. In fact, I shall argue that Plato moves from philosophical logos to a philosophical mythos in order to allow the forms to appear. Such a myth does not speak in riddles or confused images, but serves as a logon didunai for the claims of logos. Of course, the myth here in question must be true, or else it would be anti-philosophical. But what true means and where truth resides, that is the question I'll get to later. Plato's critique of anthropomorphism, the anthropomorphism of Homeric and Hesiodic myths are owed to the demands of logos. Still, even the Platonic logos requires mythos. Karl Reinhardt coined the term of Plato's new mythos or new myth, the neue Mythos, which overcomes the shortfalls of Hesiod and Homer. Perhaps we should rather refer to it as a philosophical myth than new. This new could imply being cut off from the past. Plato's philosophical myth is appropriative of the old. It is alive, transformative, and ultimately, I think, necessary to attain the highest, the idea of the good, whose significance perhaps shines through the best when we consider the Greek hetu agathu idea, the encircling visual realm, itself invisible, that lets beings appear in good order. For we only ever see and hear truly with our mind. Our eyes are not mere ontic substrate receivers of simply given sense data. Plato's appropriation of myth, I submit, is then rather a moment of Anverwandlung, a German word that is difficult to translate, or perhaps transformative appropriation of a living tradition where the appropriated myth changes as much as the one who appropriates is transformed by that myth. It is myth, old and new, which lets logos come alive. One striking example is perhaps found in Politeia 5:16c, where Plato quotes again an appropriate passage from Homer, which he had thrown out of the city at the beginning of Book 3 in the context of children's education. But this time, in Book 7, now he quotes this passage again, but now changed without the poet's mimicry of the first person. The free philosopher, that's the passage, would rather work at the fields of a foreman than return to the dockside of the cave dweller. So what Plato here leaves out is the first person that is in the original quote from Homer. Myth is, however, not a trick or a subterfuge that Plato introduces when logos, quote unquote, fails. Myth can rather with more ease address where logos and reason resort to dialectics. For example, when the unity of opposites, which the respective myths of the soul, for example, addresses and expresses in the Phaedrus and in the Politeia. Göndeling will arrive at a similar precision when he tries to articulate das harmonische Entgegengesetzte, the harmoniously oppositional. Also the Socratic dictum oida uden eidos, which I do not understand as irony, holds for Plato. That is to say, not even dialectics can resolve this contradiction. And so ultimately what the good is must be experienced. Knowing the not knowing is not outside but integral to philosophical truth, because this knowing knows of its limitations. Know thyself within reason, within bounds, know of your limitations. Gnothi seaton kai meden agan. So the two Apollonian dicta together make up the Socratic approach and the Platonic approach to philosophy. Without knowing of the not knowing, the question of the enigma, TST, what is, could not arise. In Schelling's Philosophie der Mythologie, we find a helpful remark, even though Schelling here addresses the relationship between philosophy and poetry. I shall extend this remark on the relationship between myth and logos. Schelling writes that there is a genuine need for a philosophy which has, as the quote from Schelling, has as its content also living concepts, true ideas. Such can be found in poetry, if poetry and philosophy, however far apart they may be in formal terms, come into touch. Schelling here even allows that they are of the same source. This is similar in Plato and the connection he draws between myth and logos. The claim is that to reach higher noesis, to see the idea of the good, and in theory the divine nous, Plato requires myth. So what holds for Aristotle on poetry then also holds for Plato on myth, I would say. History is just random events, yet poetry, Aristotle writes, is both more philosophical and more serious than history. Poetry speaks more of the universal history of each individual. It's in Poetics, chapter 9. Myth stands higher than recorded history. Also with Aristotle, Plato could thus be considered a philo-mythic philosopher. And I know that Plato doesn't, Aristotle doesn't address Plato here, but still, in the Metaphysics, Aristotle writes, Dio kai ho philomythos philosophos pos estin. So in some sense, the philo-mythic is a philosopher. Why? Because for mythos is composed of wonders, he continues. So I argue that in Plato, myth and logos are not diametrically opposed poles, where myth is really irrational and logos is perfectly rational. Both cannot be reduced as easily as the schema suggests, and both require each other. That myth and logos can go together is epitomized by the fact that Plato himself helps coin the term mythologia and even Mythopoesis, that's in the Republic, which means myth-like or in a mythic manner or according to the appearance of the myth. The relationship between logos and myth in Plato is such that it is precisely reversed from the standard progressive story. In Plato, myth often follows from logos. Myth steps in when logos has reached its limits, and not to replace logos, but to reinforce it. Platonic myth undergirds and reinforces the logos insofar as Platonic myth temporalizes and illustrates, makes finite or embodies or bodies forth, to use your expression, from the living forms of the imagination, Douglas Hadley's expression, to body forth, and thus locates in time and space, that's what myth does, the eternal claims of philosophical logos, even if those claims, even if those times and spaces are mythic, as we would refer to them today. So Plato's myths grant bodily appearance to the forms. To paraphrase Shelley, if logos speaks, can myth be far behind? The profound relationship between logos and myth in Plato finds its highest expression perhaps in his adaptation of the myth of the chariot as the soul's journey to Theoria in the Phaedrus. In Plato, religion and philosophy are not separate. Seeing the ideas, which are not abstract universals, but logical moments that are necessarily related to each other, and which derive their identity only from their relationship with all other moments on the plane of truth and pure theoria, which means to see, to witness, and thus to know ontologically. As you know, Ideen, Videre, and Wissen, the German Wissen. So the Greek Ideen, the Latin Videre, and the German Wissen are related, and they address something similar, seeing as a form of knowing. The divine and seeing the divine nous. The merriment and earnestness of the Olympians is not forgotten in philosophical theoria, which a word that also used to mean a festive procession. But their merriment is now appropriated and contained in the joy of philosophical seeing and knowing. Philosophical logos explicates the eternal essence of things, of beings, of what is. Philosophical myth bodies forth these essences, lets them appear. The Platonic logos moves out of and returns into myth. Perhaps what comes to mind is Meister Eckhart's question, why do you go out in order to return home? Only in this movement outwards can the soul begin to recollect the good, truth, and beauty. Thus, I would claim Plato's references to the gods of mythology are not references to ciphers or thought abstraction or vain signifiers. Platonic myths are not allegories or the code of reality. Identifying reason with the imagination, to use more contemporary terms, as Wordsworth does in the Prelude, seems then also to hold for Plato's Mythologia. The most significant question for Plato, who throws out some of the passages of the poets Hesiod and Homer, thus appears to be how myth must be structured and told to guarantee that it may lead us to the ideas and not towards our lower desires. So rather than banning everything outright, more a question of how myth must now be told or structured so that it doesn't just drive us towards our base desires, but towards reality. Plato's thought does stand under the demand, of course, of philosophical logos. But it remains connected to myth in the specific sense that I'm trying to articulate here. As mentioned before, myth seems to be able with greater ease to articulate logos, the unit, to articulate rather than logos, the unity of opposites, which eludes articulation times, at least if we ignore the sophist and the Parmenides, perhaps, these dialogues by Plato. And what is also important that is in Plato there is a primordial or primal experience of the divine at the heart of his philosophy, which also eludes articulation. Now, light requires darkness, generation, corruption, the immortal, the mortal, sound. The sound of music requires stillness, being, becoming, and even the truth, sometimes the lie. Similar as the philosopher who loves being must also hate what is not or mere seeming, even if only implicitly and thus negatively. So, to put it simply, there cannot be only pure being. There must also be seeming. I'll say a bit more on the relationship between seeming and being, Schein and Sein, in Plato in a bit. This implicit negativity is one of the main issues in Plato that has led to an overly rationalistic Platonism, a Platonism that cuts Plato off from the profoundest Greek experiences of being. This, even though we find in Plato, if we have any memory of the Greek, continued recollections of the Greek experience that Plato appropriates for the age of philosophy. Plato's polis, as Schadewald argues in his lyric, between the immutable eternal ideas, the always being, aeon, and the always becoming, aegignomenon, is the philosophical logical appropriation and transformation of a basic theme of the Greek experience between being and non-being, which in Homer, argues Schadewald, finds expression in the radical polarity of heaven and earth. Philosophically, the moment of polismos, distinction rather than separation, is the beginning of thought. The amazement out of dislocation that something is at all, paired with a striving for the eternal, which had hitherto been reserved only to the gods. Plato, I would argue, by both logos and a philosophical mythos, unifies the areas that the cosmos opens up. Platonic philosophy is within itself the unity of the opposite between the eternal and the finite, of which the philosopher is the prime exemplary, mortal, human being, striving for the eternal, learning to die precisely, to be with the ideas, striving to become as divine as possible, to enter into communion with the divine, but being at once more aware of human mortality in this homoiosis theoi. The aim of Platonic paideia is this homoiosis, which expresses the striving for the divine paired with the incapacity to reach it fully. We are the most human, the more we strive for the divine and not reach it fully. Even the less philomythic and more sober Aristotle warns against only thinking of what is mortal and human, but to strive rather towards the divine in order to attain the best life. It's in Nicomachean Ethics in the 10th book. Plato's philosophy, much more than Aristotle's, is a continuation of Greek religion. It's a communion with the gods under the auspices of Logos. Hence, he can also incorporate such phenomena as theomania, as witnessed, for example, the Apollonian oracle in Delphi, into his philosophy, which constitutes a moment of recollection and sublation. Lest we forget that sophists dominate the Greek rationalist movement, which aims to crowd out divination in the old cultus. The movement of Plato's philosophy is always ascent, anabasis, and also descent, catabasis at the same time. The soul aims for union with the eternal forms, but has to return to the body. The white and the dark horse carry the chariot. The freed philosopher has to return into the cave. The myth of the chariot is exemplary of a philosophical myth under the demands of Logos. Quote from Plato's Phaedrus: "The soul through all her being is immortal, for that which is ever in motion is immortal, but that which moves another and is moved by another, and ceasing to move ceases also to live. Only the self-moving, never leaving self, never ceases to move, and is the fountain and beginning of motion of all that moves besides. Psyche is the self-moving principle, and as such unmoved from the outside, therefore without beginning and without end. Plato dialectically here reasons for the essence of the soul and its oppositional moments, which he thinks together dialectically unifies, but it is a myth that can at least hint at, and thereby body forth the action of the self-movement of the soul. To recast myth so that it stands under the philosophical logos also implies that Plato wishes to draw myth into the dominion of divine logos, the very source of philosophy. While the logos leads to insight into the fundamental ethical concept, the dikaiosyne, or justice, in the politeia itself is, according to Plato himself, a project of mythology, of letting something appear through the creative imitation of action. So, as you remember maybe the quote from the beginning, in book 6, Plato also explicitly refers to the project of the politeia as a myth-making, or a mythic saying of the polis, and also he wonders what it is that will be required for this myth to become actual. Ergo telos is the Greek here. As mentioned at the beginning, Plato refers to the politeia as writing a myth. That's a philosophic logos which brings to the fore the eidos concept of dikaiosyne, reinforces the mythologeme of the Callipolis and vice versa. Plato returns to the myth of the Callipolis in different ways in the Critias and in the Nomoi. The politeia could then be regarded as a work of Mythopoesis, to use Tolkien's term, or perhaps mythologopoesis. And it is beyond the scope of this lecture to address in how far also the apologia is an instance of mythologeme, the tale of Socrates' trial that weaves together the philosophical heart of the matter with the actual trial proceedings. In fact, the characters in Plato's dialogues are not characters at all. They are representations of ideas. Socrates is the paradigmatic philosopher, the philosopher by which, para, the idea of the philosopher begins to show itself daily. Moreover, one should note that myth in Plato often makes an appearance when it comes to some of the most important philosophical questions, such as the eschata, the last things. Examples include the myth of the myth of the afterlife in the Gorgias, or the immortal soul in the Phaedon. An example of a mython, perhaps first things, would be the unexperienceable origin of the cosmos as presented in the Timaeus. So I don't wish to suggest that Plato merely employs myth because of its explanatory power as some sort of strategy. I think that Logos serves to pave the way to a myth that is at once connected to the traces of the old, and that also now stands under the commands of Logos and the idea. The truth of reason that philosophy seeks holds in the Platonic mythos. I think this is the significance of the term mythologia in the title of this talk. At times, this requires of Plato a reconnection with and reinterpretation of the myth of old, a Anverwandlung, as I mentioned before. At other times, this requires the writing of his own myths, such as the myths of the metals, of the cave, of primordial Athens and Atlantis to some degree, of Thuth, even though those might contain elements and traces of stories which are lost to us. Hence, we have to distinguish between, but also bring together, Plato the myth maker, and Plato the myth transformer, which I prefer over myth preserver. The ease with which the myths often arise in the dialogues, how integral they are to the theme and question at hand, speaks to the living tradition in which Plato is immersed. The accuracy about an already museal canon, a graveyard of myths, is of little significance. Now, this is a bit unorthodox, and I'm about to stay with Aristotle and Plato, but still. To Aristotle, myth is the imitation of action. In the poetry, you find this quote, "Est in de tes men praxeos mythos mimesis." Furthermore, Aristotle argues that myth in tragedy, or action or plot, is the synthesis of occurrences. Now, perhaps we could rephrase this in the context of Plato as saying that myth is synthesized ideal, a recomposition of what is and what was historically as well as mythically or poetically. And he's drawing from Homer, Hesiod, Pindar, and other sources, which the actual is to emulate. And we find such an instance in the Nomoi, actually, that I'll get to in a bit, if I have time still. So when it comes to the term mythos, there are at least two distinct ways in which Plato speaks of it. Mythos in the sense of the myths of old, handed down, for example, by Hesiod, from Hesiod and Homer, or inspired by Orphic myths. Some of these Plato describes as truthful lies, for example. It is predominantly their anthropomorphism and slender of the gods that Plato criticizes and removes. For example, Plato scolds Homer for cursing Apollo. The second is use of myth is the use, or in terms of philosophic mythos. There's the tales that Plato poetizes himself, often using elements of stories lost to us, but also using elements from Greek mystery cults. The second is not always distinct from the first, but can come in the form of a purified version of the first, reappropriated. In both instances, it is fair to consider myth in the sense of action or tale that has the power, or imitated action, that has the power to visualize a certain idea, that is to say, in the best sense, reinforcing logos. This is also why certain myths now have to be banned, for they are contrary to logos. But it is also necessary to understand that myth can speak something into being. Myth is in this sense prescriptive. The noble lie is an explicit example of this, of a prescriptive myth, something that says, or prophantic, if you like, that says something into being, as Glaucon points out himself. It will be in a few generations' time that this so-called noble lie will be believed by the inhabitants of the Callipolis. In general, myth in Plato is a tale that may imitate, but that is capable also of initiating action as well as lead on from initial seeming to being. A myth, like logos, can open one up to a certain way of understanding. Both myth and logos can open one up to see with one's nous in a specific way. To draw a distinction in contemporary parlance, the reason of myth is practical, while the reason of logos is theoretical. The concerns of practical reason in Plato's mythology are often ethical and memory, and they relate the divine. By taking into consideration the genuine purpose of myth in Plato, one can see that the forms are not to be looked for as some ghost-like hint of words. Instead, they are present in the phenomenon, or rather allow for the specific presence of beings and truth of being through myth and logos. Josef Pieper, maybe you're aware of this, argues along similar lines in his Über die platonischen Mythen from 1965. It is by way of the commands of logos, its demand to rid religion from anthropomorphism, most prominently, that another experience with the divine and with being becomes necessary and possible. In fact, the experience with the divine that logos enables is potentially more divine, as it were, since anthropomorphic gods blur the line between gods and humans, where logos, however, would remain that distinction. It is the search for God, as Schelling says in his Philosophie der Mythologie, that gave rise to mythology in the first place. Plato then does not merely rescue parts of the myths of old in an attempt to conserve them. His philosophy rather paves the way for an experience with the divine that is both mythic and logic. In fact, I would go as far as claiming that in order to grasp Plato on his own terms, the mythologic dimension is foundational. The philomythos, Plato, then, rather than the philosopher, allows one to see the dimension of sacredness and the divine mystery of philosophy, and at once ties the philosophical project and thus dialectical logic to the concealed trace contained within myth. What Karl Philipp Moritz writes in his Götterlehre also holds for Plato. Here's a quote from Moritz. The fact that a mysterious or secretive trace, geheime Spur, I always find it difficult to translate geheim. Really, fully now mysterious is not quite a secret there. It's
secret trace.
Also geheime Spur. We all know German here. To the oldest, so the fact that a mysterious or secret trace to the oldest now lost history lies concealed in the mythological poems makes them more dignified, for this means that they are neither empty dream image nor mere play of wit that disintegrates into thin air. Instead, thanks to their intimate interweaving with the oldest occurrences and stories, they have a certain weight whereby their dissolution into mere allegory can be prevented. That's Moritz. Such a trace Plato invokes, for example, in his myth of the battle between primordial Athens and Atlantis in the Critias dialogue. As Plato here interweaves the older myth of Atlantis, of which he learned from Solon, with his own origin story or myth of Athens. As Luc Brisson points out in his book Plato the Mythmaker, Plato, for example, in the second book of the Politeia, at the beginning of the Phaedrus, warns against allegorical interpretation or reappropriation of the old myths. Plato's approach to myth is a different one than, say, that of Xenophanes or that of Democritus, who, to quote Brisson, was practicing both physical and psychological allegory. Such thinkers, Brisson continues, appropriated the myths of old by, quote from Brisson, assimilating gods and heroes to physical elements, dispositions of the soul, or virtues and vices. Thus one can see how their appropriation is such that it at once anthropomorphizes the myths even further, while stripping them from their genuine weight and connection to the divine, of which Moritz speaks. Brisson continues, Plato repudiates all practice of allegory, whatever the procedure employed. So I'll just summarize this here briefly because I'm running out of time. The truth in question in Plato is not propositional truth, not so much the truth of judgment. It's not about correspondence, falsification, verification, but it's about, let's say it's an ontological truth. That is to say that Pragma, die Sache in question that is investigated, radiates of its own accord the truth of its own being, which, according to some, is also how Saint Thomas understood adequatio. What is at stake in both mythos and logos is ontological truth, and rather. So we find such strange remarks as of the true lie in the Politeia, that if I have time, I'll get to, which is paradoxical at first, but is significant if you consider that Plato is concerned with the movement from imitation to being. Okay, I'll leave out this here. I'll leave out the sections on the Timaeus. We might have time to discuss this, perhaps the Ecos Mythos. Let me just perhaps summarize briefly. No, I'll leave it out for now. It's better to leave it out. Now, I'd like to turn to two instances that I'm aware of, at least, where Plato speaks of in the Greek Mythologia. In Book 6 of the Nomoi, for example, and in the beginning of the Critias dialogue. In the first instance, the Athenian refers to Clinias in his endeavor to sketch an ideal polis as follows. It is Greek, ego dao soi solepsistai kata ten parusan hemin tanun mythologian. In most translations in English that I found, Mythologia is given as simply conversation, which on the face of it makes sense. So the sentence would mean, our conversation, I will in turn assist you. And that would be a standard translation. Bury, however, suggests the much stronger translation of Mythologia as imaginative sketch. Schöpster, in his German translation, similarly suggests Entwurf for Mythologia. So Mythologia here seems to mean the ideal of a polis, which the Athenian and Clinias sketch out together. The Athenian proposes the ideal of the polis in the form of a myth, which itself cannot be fully actualized, but which lends itself as an ideal to which the actual is to conform to. Thus here, mythos takes on the significance of paradigma, but a paradigma which finite human logos has access to. Mythologia translates, if we stay closer to the Greek, as the logical saying of what is a myth and what in this sense ought to be. His Athenian here might be referring back to page 12 of the Nomai, where he speaks of a myth or legend about benevolent and prudent rulers of the Homeric age. This myth is even akin to an oracle, says the Athenian, and as such proven, which is to say that the legend of the potential benevolent and prudent ruler of the past, who would be the best ruler, becomes an oracle which imaginatively can say something into being in the here and now. This is what Mythologia in the Nomoi seems to imply. We can see here also an instance where Plato ties his own myth-making to a myth known to his fellow Athenians, the story of Nestor, in such a way that it forms part of the philosophical mythology about the just city. So if you consider the passage again, kataten parousan hemin tanin mythologian, paremi, the verb means to be present, but also to be of help. As you know, parousia means being and presence. So perhaps you could think of this passage as saying, for the sake of letting something come into presence, we relate our mythology. So it is by mythology that the paradigma of the ideal city comes to be present. And this imaginative sketch that relates also to a legend, and in this way helps to make present what is absent. I'll skip over the part 2. 1 second. Now, the relationship of seeming and being that I've mentioned briefly before, that's where Plato bans the poets. The reason for this is the relationship between seeming and being. As you know, Plato wishes to throw out ekbalein, the poets from the Callipolis. This has caused some commentators to condemn the supposed censorship of the politeia, but they might presumably also ban the politeia once the open society has been installed. There are profound philosophical reasons why Plato suggests to throw out some of the passages of the myths currently circulating in Athens. One of the reasons Plato gives for throwing out the poets is the following. This is again, I follow Luc Brisson here. It's a summary of his of Brisson's work on Plato's critique of allegory. This one paragraph here. So hyponoia is the term that designates allegory. Hyponoia suggests that there is a concealed meaning in the myths. Hyponoia could also, in a more literal sense, translate as the reason or understanding underneath. A young soul is not capable of properly understanding concealed meaning. Educating and forming the young soul properly so that it may find its place in the polis is however seriously in jeopardy if myths carry hidden meanings which the young soul cannot discern. How could the young soul imitate what it does not understand? For the non-philosophical onlooker, this must appear censorship, but philosophically significant is here the apparent relationship between seeming and being. A good myth, even if false, must hence present its sense outright when it comes to the education of children. With regard to the poets, Plato prefers diegesis to mimesis, because the former does not require the poet to speak in the voice of someone else. So here in this context, mimesis seems to mean only imitation. The Callipolis must censor those passages where the poets perform pola mimesitai, manifold mimicry. The poet is not to hide behind one of their characters, regardless of the narrative style. Each text will prompt mimetic imitation on the part of its readers or listeners. Mimesis can be of service precisely when it serves to imitate the good, so Plato allows for this at Politeia 394c. Especially the guardians of the polis from early childhood onwards are to imitate only the pious, the noble, the courageous, never that which is nefarious or shameful. And the philosophical reason Plato gives for warning against certain contents is precisely the power of mimesis. Playful imitation can produce initial seeming or illusion, which in turn can lead to being. One may become what one imitates. Plato writes, "Ectes mimesios," from imitation, "tu renaia polausis," the being gets carried forth. From imitation, from mimesis, being in the active verbal sense may very well arise. The stories one hears may distort what someone, given their soul, ought to be. So someone who has a golden soul hears the wrong kind of story and therefore deteriorates. This, however, also seems to imply that mimesis is not only imitation, but also creative or generative. When they listen to myths, children's souls are filled with doxai, images or illusions. So it is the task of the polis to ensure that those doxai are not in opposition to the doxai that the polis requires to maintain its good order. But this does not mean, I think, that all myths or poetry are to be banned. They are instead to be selected to serve the good of the polis. Appropriate myths are then also a way of initiation towards the appropriate rule of the polis, precisely because of the vicinity of Schein und Sein, of seeming and being. All right. How long do I have? About
10 minutes, perhaps, at
yeah,
most.
okay, maybe. Yeah. Okay, I'll skip over a few things. Okay, maybe briefly on the true line, and this is still the Politeia. This is Plato. We first tell children myths, mythos legomen, and these are considered on the whole to be called false, but furthermore also true. So in the Greek, that's roughly pseudos en dekai aleche. So I didn't think that talk of verification or falsification is helpful when it comes to Plato. It sounds a bit too empiricist to me. So I don't think that Plato condemns the myths for being false, in the sense of not being, you cannot verify that they didn't happen, but instead that they can put forth a certain movement towards disorder of the polis, precisely because of the relationship between mimesis and being, if I understand that correctly. So, so the difficulty is when it comes to educating children to form the soul in such a way that the images and ideas the child's soul finds within itself and receives from the outside correspond to the genuinely to that which is genuinely good. For seeming can become being, as Plato seems to be aware. So in Plato, Schein and Sein, doxa kai usia, seeming and being are neighbors, as they also are in Hegel. Philosophy cannot remain with that which only seemingly is, to quote from Plato again, doxamenois enai. But this distinction is not as clear-cut as it may seem. The vicinity of seeming and being, I think, finds expression in the Greek here, doxamenois enai. As you know, in English we can say this seems to be, which also has a similar significance. What philosophical logos rather has to do is to bring into its domain the apparent illusions of myth to try and grant it a being of its own. And this is exactly what enables the noble lie to work. Now, as you know, and I mentioned this before, Plato warns a certain passage of Hesiod and Homer, but God is supposed to be only good and true and immutable and non-deceptive, whereas the gods in the Homeric myths are mutable, they change their appearance. Here's a quote that Plato, from the Odyssey that Plato quotes, the gods in the likeness of strangers, many disguises assume as they visit the cities of mortals. Socrates cries out, and how said I, should a god wish to lie, and that he displays to us in word or deed an empty shadow image. Hence, again, these true untruths, which could very well lead to a corruption of the soul, those must be banned or reappropriated in a way. And Plato does consider a reappropriation of the myths that, in a sense, in a way that they have been purified. Okay, I could briefly. I think if it comes up in the discussion, I could probably get to the noble lie, but I think it's enough for now. I've been reading for 40 minutes, so
So thank you very much indeed.